You're listening to the Business Communicators.
The elections out of Virginia was interesting, and the polling about
New Jersey.
New Jersey. Yeah, thank you. Where there was a poll that came out 2 or 3 weeks prior to the election, and it was just wrong. I vividly remember the picture from the 50s where the president's holding it up, saying that he lost the election as
Dewey defeats Truman. Yeah.
That's what goes through my head. And so what are your thoughts? Because we're communicators. You external, I do measurement, and I've done voice customer, voice of employee. There's a whole lot of different ways that this kind of goes from it. And so I wanted to see what your take is on, one, polling and accuracy, and two, why is the media releasing it?
Yeah, so media always needs something to talk about, right? Especially during campaign season. I think they need data to, pass along a narrative that candidate A is doing better than candidate B, or maybe candidate B has a lot of ground to make up, and here's what they need to do to make up that ground. But the problem is, dating back to 2016, the polls, whether it's the New York Times, whether it's 538, whether it's, the Harris poll, so many different polls that are out there have been wrong, in terms of margin of victory. And even if they did ultimately predict that the right candidate would win, like, for example, in New Jersey, they did project that the Democratic governor would win. The race was a lot closer than the polls indicated it would be. And if you go back to 2016, 538 said that Donald Trump had a 38% chance of winning the 2016 election. And then you see throughout the night that it shifts, that it goes back and forth on a pendulum, and ultimately he won the election. And in 2020, I think it was pretty well assumed that Biden would win on election night, but there were states that were a lot closer than the polling indicated that it would be. And so I do think there is value in polling, right? It gives you insights on, what is the pulse of America thinking? What are my customers thinking when it comes to a certain product or a certain campaign strategy that we have going on? But I remember raising this question in 2016 or early 2017 at a all hands meeting at a company that I worked for, because we did a lot of polling. Were consumers understanding our message? How did they view our brand amongst our competitors? And with the inaccuracies that I saw in the 2016 election, I asked the question, can we be sure that our data in our polling is actually correct? And the answer was, we feel confident about it. And so at that point, you think, okay, maybe 2016 was just an aberration. But we're seeing that more and more polling is just inaccurate when it's proven by results. And so what is the cause of that? Is it because a lot of people have gotten rid of their landlines? Is it because people don't pick up their phone? Are people picking up their phone usually a certain type of demographic or age or political bias? And so there's a lot of questions that I have whether or not polls are even remotely accurate and how much we should rely on polls. But Thomas, I think you come from kind of a different perspective on polling, that maybe it's not the polls that are wrong, but the polls are maybe keeping people away from the ballot box.
First part is people can cherry pick how they want the polls to go. I had a good friend, there was 5 of us in a group, and he did something stupid. And I said, I took a random sample of 20% of our group, and they agreed 100% that you did something stupid. He's like, you only served one person. I'm like, yep. And it was also me. Yeah. So it kind of also goes back to the show, is like, hey, Austin, raise your hand if you think this is the #1 podcast. And both of us raise our hand. 100% agree that we're the #1 podcast for business communications in the world. And so there's a whole lot of sample bias. If you're doing the in-person, whoever the person doing the interview normally skews more towards people that look like them. If you only do phones, landlines, then you miss out on the cell phone population. And so my thought is you really need to target or get those big companies that show that do it right because of the bias in there. But then the second part of that comes into play is, are some of these polls self-fulfilling prophecies, meaning that I want a survey to prove what we're doing is good, or I want to prove that my candidate is doing better. I think a lot of the surveys, to your point, are great internal. Hey, what's our market share? Hey, what's our customers truly think of us? Hey, what's this? What's that? But releasing it to the public 2 or 3 weeks prior, because I think a lot of both the Democrats and the Republicans are crying foul on this information being released because, it's been shown that nobody wants to vote for a loser. We live here in Texas, so you hear a lot of people who say my vote doesn't count because this
Yep.
is such a red state. I'm not going to go vote. My vote doesn't count. But if you see a poll 2 weeks before and your candidate's losing by 50%, 45% or something like
What's
that.
the incentive for you to go out?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so I'm almost to the point where maybe these should be op-eds, opinion pieces more so than front page news, or the media should do a better job educating. Here's what the polls are saying. Here's what they do. And I'm looking at all of the 4 major ones. I'm looking at all the major newspapers because it goes back to it is you can look at I think Ed Emmett said it best at an IABC luncheon a long time ago when he was teaching at Rice, said, if you want to see something interesting, watch the 4 major news networks. They'll cover the same story and you'll come out with 4 different beliefs for the exact same facts. And so I think the media needs to step up and own, hey, this is a research piece. It's designed for XYZ. Here's what we did. And that the research should be there. Without that, then all we're doing is just fueling more fear. Let's go back to the Facebooks and divide America.
Yeah. I mean, you look at margin of error in polling. Margin of error, every single poll is going to have like a -2.5 or ±2.5, which means that if you did the poll 100 times, that it would come within that range. So, +2.5, -2.5 on either side. So 100 times, that's what it would be. The problem is some of these margins of error in reality are 11 points off. And that means that the actual results of the election are not even remotely close within the margin of error. But I do see your point that, perhaps, polling, it does, those voters that are on the fence that are so critical and actually, maybe shifting a policy one way or the other, you're not incentivized to go out if okay, well, the person I want to win, they're not going to win, so I'm just going to stay home. I get that. So maybe that comes with just rewriting the elections. I don't know. I host a podcast on called Cautious Coffee. We're actually talking about different voting alternatives, and one was sort of like a lottery. And this is a really like fun thought experiment. But maybe you have people that want to run for office, and then it's a lottery based on who wins. And the legislator, for example, it's determined on certain issues, similar to like a jury duty, right? As a jury is picked to determine a case one way or the other. Maybe there's a certain policy on the table, like tax incentives for a local school district or something like that. And you are elected as part of your duty. Maybe you're called by a jury to go in and determine what the outcome is. And I thought that was fascinating. It's probably, harder to do in principle. It was a fun thought experiment. But yeah, I know in a moment we're going to talk about Aaron Rodgers. And to me, this comes down to just polling in general, how polling does create biases. And in college football, which we're both huge fans of,
Yes,
this is a major, major issue because there's so many biases in place with preseason polls, right? Alabama, every single year, they're going to start the football season 1, 2, or 3, or 4, somewhere in that range. And then the SEC, because it's been perceived for years that they are the dominant league because Alabama wins the national championship almost every year, that every team in the SEC is good. And so you have 8, 9, 10 teams in the SEC that are within the top 30, 35 teams in the country. And so you see this bias exist in the polls. Like, if a Texas A&M beats Alabama, then by golly, Texas A&M, even though they have 2 losses and a close win against Colorado, they're definitely a top 15 team. Maybe if you watch them play, maybe they're not, but they beat Alabama on a consistent basis. No. And the problem is when you get later in the season and you start having these committees like the College Football Playoff Committee come in, they're ranking these Power 5 conferences. They're giving them the benefit of the doubt, that a close loss is better than, a win for a smaller school who, you have Cincinnati. the number 2 team according to the coaches and the AP poll, but in the college football playoff poll, they're number 7 because they don't play against these name brand teams. So polling doesn't just impact the political side. It impacts sports. It impacts businesses. Like biases, I don't know that you can have a poll that is fully removed of biases.
And yeah, being a sports fan and the college playoff, and so we talk the polls, the top 25 polls. We love to talk preseason. The Astros lost the World Series, even though on the polls we should have won on paper. But that's why we play the sports. And to your point, Cincinnati, these implications for the top 4 have millions of dollars attached to this implication. Millions of dollars, probably close to $1 billion, because that's an extra game for television revenue. That's an extra game for the conference. That's an extra game for this. And so Cincinnati being the perfect example, and yes, they're gonna move over to a Power 5 conference in the next probably 2 to 3 years, but them not getting put into there, where there's 4 spots in the college football playoffs, 4 spots, and so one, they need to expand the college football playoff system. I'm a fan of 8 teams to kind of pick up a little bit difference. But if you're a top 10 team, your chances of beating the number 1 team are there. To your point, A&M beating Alabama, are they going to win all the time? No. But it's a lot closer than you care to admit. That's why March Madness and college basketball is so good, that a 16 seed was able to knock off a number 1 seed one time in the tournament history. But that possibility is there, where your smaller schools or your smaller conferences aren't even allowed to play in there. Appalachian State beating Michigan a couple years ago.
Yeah, let's just take some revenue in this conversation. So if you look at the college football playoff, and this is why this polling matters financially to these universities, the Power 5 conferences, the ACC made $78 million last year in bowl payouts. And again, these are distributed to all of the schools. So it's like a bonus at the end of the year. Big 10, 79 million. Big 12, 78 million. SEC, 76 million. Pac-12, 70 million. So all of those schools are relatively similar in terms of payouts. The American Athletic Conference, 27 million. That's a huge gap. And so having a school like a Cincinnati maybe polling a little bit higher is the difference between a school getting a $2 million payout and a school getting a $10 million payout. And so it's a huge financial incentive. So I don't know what the solution is.
Well, and it's funny, you're talking about like the SEC playing each other. And I think we need to try to get someone from the SEC on our podcast to talk the business.
Southeastern Conference, not the Securities and Exchange Commission.
Well, we'll take some SEC because it is earnings season too. But the football SEC conference, because their bowl season, they worked very hard to craft that they are the best
100%.
Conference in the world. They cherry pick the bowl games. Like it's not like most conferences who said, okay, year 1, you're going to the Rose Bowl. Year 2, you're going to the Idaho Spud Potato Bowl. Year 3, you're going to, I don't know the rest of them off the top of my head. But where the SEC comes in is they'll turn around and say, okay, you're number 2 and you're number 4, but the number 4 matches better to the team that they're playing. So they'll put the number 4 versus number 2 to make it work the SEC. So they're in essence stacking the deck in their favor. So they work very hard. Kudos to them. But is it good for sports? I don't know that.
Is it good for the podcast? I mean, do people want to hear us talk about college sports and college football revenue? I don't know.
I don't know either. But while we're talking,
we'll find out when we look at the listen rates and at 20 minutes of the conversation, the numbers tanked.
Yes.
You've been listening to the Business Communicators.